from now, just to note. Okay, I guess we start, and then after you start, then I'll admit others in the waiting room. So, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of myself and my friend Sebastian Geiger from Heriot-Watt, we would like to welcome you all to the second GeoScience and GeoEnergy Keynote webinar. Please kindly mute your microphones, but feel free to keep your videos on so our speaker receives all possible online chemistry one can wish for. It's our pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Martin Blunt as our keynote speaker. Martin is a professor of petroleum engineering at Imperial College London since 1999. He's known for groundbreaking work in multi-phase flow in porous media with many applications from oil and gas recovery to geological carbon storage and contaminant transport and cleanup in polluted aquifers. He leads experimental, theoretical, and numerical research into many aspects of flow and transport in porous systems, including pore-scale imaging, modeling and analysis of displacement processes, and large-scale simulations. Martin earned his MA and PhD degrees both in theoretical physics from Cambridge University, then became research reservoir engineer with British Petroleum in England, then moved to California, where he became assistant and then associate professor of petroleum engineering at Stanford University. The department name was later changed to Energy Resource Engineering, ERE. He left Stanford to become a professor at Imperial College London. He served as head of the Department of Earth Science and Engineering at Imperial from 2006 until 2011. Professor Blunt has received a number of awards during his career. He was elected to the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2019, became Celsius Lecturer at University of Uppsala in the same year, and those were just a few to mention. Also, he has received honorary lifetime membership award of Interpore Society, International Society of Porous Media, which is the most prestigious award of the society. His many awards are not just for his excellent research, but also teaching, as he has also received the President's Medal for Excellence in Teaching. He has been keynote speaker of countless seminars and scientific events. Martin is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Transport in Porous Media. He has over 250 scientific publications. His Google Scholar page shows most of them, with over 28,000 citations. Also, recently, he has published a good book on multi-phase flow in permeable media, a Pore-scale perspective, with Cambridge University Press. It is our pleasure and honor to host Martin as our keynote lecturer of GeoScience and GeoEnergy webinar series. His talk will be lasting for about 30 minutes. And after that, please, like before, type in text your questions in the chat room, and Sebastian will go through them as much as the time allows. Martin, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Hadi, for that introduction. Thank you for Hadi and Sebastian for arranging this. And I must admit, I'm delighted to be able to give this seminar and to maybe take the advantage, right, of this remote situation to talk to actually quite a lot of people at one time. I'd like to acknowledge straight away the large research group. I'm particularly fortunate at the moment to have a very talented group of students from all around the world, and they're acknowledged there on the title slide. So it's really their work that I'm going to describe today. So I'm going to start straight away with showing what it is we do. So we have a multi-scale imaging lab at Imperial. Obviously, it's closed at the moment, but we got plenty of results to analyze. So everyone's keeping busy. If we look here, this looks like a medical CT scanner because it is. okay? And that is used to look inside rocks with a resolution of around about 1 millimeter, okay? But we can look at larger samples up to 1 meter long. But the main thing we do is we look at samples that are between about 5 and 15 millimeters in diameter. So I've got a little rock sample here. It's going to be a little bit smaller than this, okay? And what we can do is we use an X-ray microscope, right, which is what's shown here, okay? So we have a beam of X-rays that goes into the rock, and it can image the rock at resolutions down to a micron. So we can actually look inside the pore space. But the key thing is we can also look at the fluids inside the porous medium. So you can see this is in this sort of, golden jacket. What we're doing there is we're imposing a controlled high temperature, and we can also impose a high temperature. So we can look at the rock at micron resolution and the fluids at conditions that you might encounter deep underground in the subsurface. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're looking at, okay? We can also go to a synchrotron source. So here, what is shown here is the beam of X-rays. It's so strong that it's ionizing the air. That's why it shows. This is a control room, right? The students are outside. You're dead within a second if you're inside. And then you can image, because it's a bright source, you can image really rapidly. And we can get down to a 1 second time resolution now. So it is like that cartoon. So you've got X-ray spectacles. But it's even better than that because it's 3-dimensional imaging. So every second we can take a billion voxel 3-dimensional image of the rock and the fluids within the pore space. Okay, so what are we trying to do? We're trying to describe multi-phase flow in porous media. And so shown here are 2 key equations. This is Darcy's law. This is the flow of a phase per unit area per unit time. And the key function here is Kr. That's the relative permeability, and it's a function of saturation. And it basically tells us the relationship between flow rate and grad P, which is the pressure gradient. So the key thing here is this relative permeability. The next thing is there's a pressure gradient in, say, oil or water or gas or whatever the phases are, and there's a pressure difference between those phases, and that's called the capillary pressure, okay? And that's related here to R1 and R2, which are the interfacial curvatures. So it's related to the curvature of the interface between the 2 fluids at the small scale, at the micron scale. So the 2 functions of interest are the relative permeability as a function of saturation and the capillary pressure as a function of saturation. So that traditionally is what we're interested in. And as I said there, certainly in the oil industry, several $1 billion a year are spent on measuring these properties, right? Using traditional techniques, which I'm not going to describe, normally measuring them quite badly, to be honest. So the question is, can we do better in our understanding of this? And we're going to approach this problem really experimentally, which is we're going to look and see what's going on, okay? Then that has implications for the theory, for interpretation, and maybe for traditional measurements. But the starting point is let's just see what's going on, okay? Now, the question is, why should we look inside rocks? And obviously, sort of from the way I've begun, and obviously from Hadi's introduction, most of the work I do is related to hydrocarbon recovery. And so we're sitting here at a time where basically you can't give away oil, okay? So, you might say, well, not really the best timing for this seminar. And certainly, yeah, the oil industry is like many industries, but one might say particularly suffering at the moment. But the point is, we still have a whole society which is utterly reliant on hydrocarbons. I mean, you can't really think of anything that we use that doesn't use oil and gas directly, or it's used in its manufacture or in its transport. Okay, and so yes, the oil price has collapsed because demand has collapsed because of COVID, but that's also because it's having a huge impact in the economy. And the impact on the oil and gas industry and the impact on the economy are basically the same thing in our modern society. Okay, but it's not the only application. Clearly, we need to transition to a world, and if we're going to get something good out of COVID, we're probably going to hasten that transition towards a world where we are not so reliant on hydrocarbons. So are there other applications? The answer is yes. Groundwater resources. Most of the fresh water on the planet is not in lakes and reservoirs. It's actually in porous rock and porous soil underground. And we all need to drink. Okay, so we definitely need wise harnessing of groundwater resources and understanding pollution and preventing and cleaning up pollution. The other one is to deal with the threat of climate change, to collect CO2 from point sources and to store it underground. And I've got a simple diagram here, just repeating some of these other applications. But here, these are different scenarios of where we might head to avoid dangerous climate change. On this graph are the gigatons. That's billions of tons of CO2 that will be stored per year. And we're looking under all these different scenarios, somewhere between 5 and 30 gigatons of CO2 per year against time. Now, of course, we're here, we're storing very little at the moment, but if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change in a way that makes any sort of economic sense, we need to basically put as much CO2 underground as the oil and gas we currently produce. Okay, so we create this enormous industry in terms of managing the subsurface. So the geological applications of this are enormous, and they're real challenges. You know, simply doing traditionally what we do in the oil industry, which is we drill a well, oil comes out. If the oil price is high, we make loads of money. If the oil price is low, we're worried about it. But we never really are forced to know exactly what's going on. We're going to be engineering the subsurface to save the planet. People are actually going to ask a bit harsher questions. You know, do we really understand? Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is actually porous materials, flowing porous media is not in any sense confined to geological applications. Okay, so here is just a cartoon of a fuel cell. It's a way of taking hydrogen and oxygen and generating electricity. Okay, so if we're moving towards a low carbon society, fuel cells, batteries are obviously big things. Here, what you have, rather interestingly, is what's called a gas diffusion layer. You need the gas, say the hydrogen, to move through a porous medium. Here at the electrodes, you produce water and you want the water to escape. You want both the gas and the water to be flowing through this fibrous material over a very wide range of saturation. You want to keep the gas continuous, you want to keep the water continuous, so actually the water can escape. Okay, so bear with me on that one. Right? So you want something where you can have two-phase flow over a wide range of saturation. What are the conditions of this porous medium you need? And this presentation is actually going to tell you what you need. And then actually it turns out that's actually what people are doing, but it also gives you some implications for better design. Some other things, drug delivery, food preparation are often done using microfluidic devices. Microfluidic devices is just another way of saying flowing porous media. Right? So when we talk about flowing porous media at micron scale pores, that's what everyone else calls microfluidics. Here on the bottom left is someone wearing a face mask. I'd have to say in Britain, the only way you can see someone in a face mask is actually on the internet, right? Because there's no protective equipment, even for doctors and nurses who need them, let alone for the general public. But anyway, here's a picture. And obviously, this is a big issue, right? How do you design a face mask? It obviously wants to absorb droplets of material. It wants to have sufficiently high permeability that you can breathe, but very low permeability for anything that's in a wetting phase. Okay, so again, how would we design a face mask that would do that? Okay, and how would you, obviously that's to do with permeability, but it's also clearly a multi-phase flow problem, right? So there are lots and lots of applications. Okay, so what are we doing? The key thing here is this imaging. Right? The new thing is that we're able to image in 3 dimensions porous media with a range of techniques, not just X-rays, basically from about 10 nanometer to micron resolution and above. Okay. When it comes to modeling, the other thing is that there is nowadays very good quality public domain software. Now, it's not that we download and press a button, but we download it and we can adapt it to our purposes. And what this means is that we can focus on doing something innovative about porous media rather than having to write things from scratch. You know, it used to be when I started out, you know, you'd have to write, you know, a conjugate gradient routine to solve your equations. That's been done for you. Now you can focus on the porous media problem. Okay. So the idea is to combine this, right? To combine this to get to a better understanding. So here are the key points. Okay. You know, there are lots of applications. right? I'd actually put it very strongly. I think our future really depends on understanding this. I mean, it doesn't mean to say you have to do everything I've got here, but it is understanding flow in the subsurface is important, and porous media in general is vital. Okay, and we do need to have a fundamental understanding. I think sort of bumbling away with our current, totally successful to date, but our current sort of understanding isn't going to get us there. The other thing that people often think is that, you know, computers are getting bigger and faster, and we've got fancy CFD methods, so all we need to do is model it, right? We're just going to model it, right? So we don't really, you know, the experiment's a bit of an aside, or we're going to model it so well that we don't need to do experiments, and I completely disagree with that. Actually, I mean, I'm a theoretician and a modeler by training, but most of our activity is now experimental. And when we do the experiments, we uncover things that we hadn't anticipated. Okay, so I'm not saying there isn't a role for this. There's definitely one, but the focus of this presentation is actually in what we observe. So let's get straight to the chase. Okay, let's talk about CO2 storage. So this is one of the first things we did in our lab, and the focus here is going to be on the work that we've done at Imperial, and that's not in any way to diminish the contributions of many other groups. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the work at Imperial, but there are lots of groups around the world who are using this technology extremely successfully. So what the concern here is, I'm going to inject CO2 into a piece of rock. You can see here it's about 2 centimeters long. It's about 6 millimeters in diameter. And we're going to inject CO2 deep underground into, say, saline aquifers for storage. And the concern is this: you inject it, and the blue color is the CO2 that's continuous through the pore space. The different colors here are bits of CO2 that are trapped, right? They're surrounded by water. The CO2 is continuous. So this is the problem. You inject the CO2, it's continuous, it's got a low viscosity, it's going to flow, it's going to escape, it's going to be a disaster. Right? However, what happens is as the CO2 moves, right, it doesn't, what's left behind, it's not a vacuum, it's displaced by water. So when you have water that displaces the CO2, because there's no other way it can move, it can't sort of just move as a bubble, right? It has actually a displacement process in a porous medium. What you see here is that most of the CO2 is left behind, and the different colors are ganglia of CO2 trapped in the pore space. So we know this is a traditional measurement of how much is trapped against how much I put in. And we actually, first of all, did some traditional measurements on pieces of rock about this size, okay, where we just sort of what comes in and what comes out, okay, and we got the results that we can see here. And this was with oil water, this was with CO2, and we can see that we trap, you know, about 30% of the pore space, where we put in about just over 50%. So we're trapping somewhere between half and 2/3 of what we put in. But now we can see it. And then you say, well, that was just a fluke experiment. The beautiful thing about these micro experiments is we can inject the CO2, we can image it, then we can dissolve away the CO2, and we can repeat the experiment. And we can repeat it once, twice, thrice, 5 times in the end. Okay? And we see each experiment, slightly different arrangements of fluids, and this is a challenge for modeling because it's not totally deterministic even on the same system, but statistically the amount trapped and the distribution of cluster size is the same. And then you say, okay, well, you just did it on one special case, then we did it on another sandstone and we got the same. Okay, so here are the raw images for people who are a little bit cynical because there's a lot of image processing that went in. This is actually what we see from the X-rays. Then there was the idea that maybe carbonates are different because carbonates maybe have a calcium carbonate CO3 surface, and maybe that interacts with the CO2 and makes it wetting, and so there's less of this trapping in the pore space. It turns out, actually, for carbonates, it's complex. It's not that it's identically the same, but we still retain in the pore space trapped a large fraction. Right. So this is 2 limestones that we have here. Okay, so we can see the trapping. But what about this X-ray specs? So hopefully there's a video playing for everyone. Okay, so what's shown in yellow is the non-wetting phase. That's actually oil in this case. I'm not showing the rock. And what's happening is from the bottom, I can get my cursor to work, water is moving in from the bottom here. So water is moving in. We're not showing the water in the rock. We're just showing the oil. And what you're noticing is the water's moving in. It's not pushing out all the oil. It's trapping the oil in the pore space. So now with synchrotron imaging, and you can see there's a timestamp. This is not in real time. It's sped up. We're actually taking pictures every minute in here, we can actually see the dynamics of the process. So we can see how the trapping occurs. Okay. So this is the next slide. So hopefully those movers are started. So here, this is a blow up. This is a real piece of rock with real fluids at high pressures, and we're measuring this in 3 dimensions. So what we're seeing here, this is on a loop, clearly. Okay, some of the oil is pushed out directly by the water. Okay, so that's produced. But here, what happens here? Okay, you see this region here gets narrower because there's water in wetting layers that swell and snap off. Now, snap-off is a process we've actually known for many years, right? Roland Lenormand looked at these in micromodel experiments in the 80s. Now we're seeing it inside a rock. We can actually see what the process is. This isn't necessarily a radical discovery, but we know that this process is happening inside the rock, and we have some confidence that this is going to give us storage security for CO2. Not such good news for oil recovery, because obviously the oil is being retained in the pore space. Okay, the other picture on the right is just fancy image analysis, right? We're sort of rotating the view so you can see it from lots of different angles. Okay, that's fine, but that hasn't really quantified anything. Because I started with capillary pressure and relative permeability, and someone might say, yeah, okay, lovely pictures, but yeah, I actually want, in my models, I want this relative permeability, I want this capillary pressure. So what we've got here is we've got actually a sample of Bentheimer sandstone. So it's the same, actually the same rock as here. Okay, so it's like a sample like this. Okay, so what we do is we do a traditional steady state relative permeability experiment that some people were familiar with, but it's not radically different in terms of design. We start out with initial water, the oil is shown in red. This fractional flow of water, that means we're just injecting oil. And then we reproduce what would happen in an oil field where we do water flooding. We have a 30% fractional flow, and 30% fractional flow means it's 30% water, 70% oil. Okay, so we can see that oil has moved into the pore space. And then we increase the fractional flow in steps to 1 so that we have just water flowing and the oil is trapped. And we can do this at different capillary numbers. This is a ratio of viscous to capillary forces. So this is in a capillary controlled limit, the first experiment. The second one is at a slightly higher capillary number. And we see, if you look carefully, if you're eagle-eyed, you see some yellow bits. The yellow bits are actually during the hour long that it takes to take this image. We actually see the oil and water are flip-flopping a bit. So there are bits where there's oil present, bits where the water. So we begin to see some dynamics. And I'm going to describe that briefly later on in the presentation. So what we can do is you do this experiment, you measure a pressure drop, you know the fractional flow, this is traditional stuff. You measure the saturation from the images, and this actually enables you, I'm not going to go through the mathematics, but it should be relatively straightforward, it's standard. Here's the relative permeability, here's the saturation. You get classic water-wet relative permeabilities, and there's some details here about correcting the measurements for a capillary end effect in case anyone asks, and we can also compare it with other measurements in the literature, and this is straightforward. The other beautiful thing is, if we got these images of the fluids in the pore space, we can also look at the interface between them, and we can measure the curvature of the interface. And from the Young-Laplace equation, we can then measure the capillary pressure. So that's what we've done here. These are our image-based measurements. This is drainage and imbibition measured, again, on a larger sample, independently by another group. And the results correspond. And they're a complementary technique, because it turns out traditional mercury injection are very good at looking at the endpoints where you're really squeezing things in at really high pressure. They're not really so good when the capillary pressure is low, because the pressure is small. This is where our technique comes into its own, because our technique works when there's a large radius of curvature that we can image. So our technique works for low pressures. Traditional techniques work for high pressures. So actually, this is all looking pretty good. But then someone might say, very nice, Martin, but most rocks aren't water wet. Okay, that's fine for CO2 storage. Okay, fair enough. But if we're looking at oil recovery, we know that the crude oil has been in contact with the rock surfaces, and some surface active components have adhered to the surface. So here's an experiment where we did exactly the same on Bentheimer, but now we'd aged it in some crude oil. So now we see, okay, this is the water wet case in blue. Okay, fair enough, uncontroversial. The mixed wet case, now the oil is wetting, so the oil relative permeability is lower. but the water relative permeability is also low. The residual oil saturation is about 11%, and that entirely corresponds to traditional measurements, okay? But the capillary pressure, when we tried, well, actually Shell sponsored this work. When Shell tried to measure it in a centrifuge, they just said it was a bust, 0. We get a very small but negative capillary pressure because we've altered the wettability, but it's a very low capillary pressure. So that's a bit strange. What's going on? Because actually, this looks quite favorable for recovery. All right? Actually, low water relative permeability, that means the water's held in the pore space. The oil has a low relative permeability, but actually, where the two rel perms cross is at quite a high saturation. So it's actually, this should give you quite good water flood recovery. So let's explore that a bit more. Let's look at a reservoir sample. So this is a sample from Abu Dhabi. So this is work funded by ADNOC. And this is a reservoir carbonate aged in their crude oil. And you can see immediately, we see something very different from the water wet case. After water flooding, you see that the water is in the big pores. The oil here is in some small pores and confined to layers. Okay. The other thing that I will say just about this subject, right? Traditionally in the oil industry, everything is secret. Everything's behind you, and the SPE's behind a paywall. You know, you sort of don't give all the information away because you don't, you know, you're sort of worried. Here, all those images are on the Digital Rock portal. So this is hosted by UT Austin, and I have to say it's a great service to the community. So the images are on Digital Rock's portal. The papers are open access papers, and the codes that we use for analysis are public domain. So we actually are trying to move into the 21st century in terms of sharing data as well. Something that the oil industry, again, is still pretty well 17th century, thinking that keeping data secret, right, makes you powerful, right? And, you know, it's a bit like when Hooke came up with Hooke's law, right, in the 1600s. He wrote it down backwards in Latin so that he was the only person in the world who knew it. No one else did. That makes him really clever. Right, nowadays, we know that's not how the world should work, okay? We should share data. So the oil industry needs to know that. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so here we're talking about wettability, right? There's sort of mixed wet. What's going on? So we really need to quantify this with measuring content angle. Okay, so what we have here is, again, this is an experiment. This is on a limestone where we're zooming through the image in 3 dimensions, okay? And we've segmented the image so that you can see the individual blobs. These are CO2. This is CO2 trapped in the pore space of the rock, okay? So the individual colors just represent the different trapped blobs. It's just fancy image processing. There's no significance here. So we want to measure contact angle. We want to measure the wettability, okay? And the contact angle, okay, is defined, right, as we go through the image. It's where the 2 phases, CO2 and water in this case, contact solid. Okay, so here we have just the raw image, CO2 there in the middle, water is shown in blue, and the red is the rock. Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to show with the yellow line the 3-phase contact line. So that's where the 2 fluids represent the surface. And what we do with our image, and of course this is sort of flying around with lots of image processing, but we can now do it automatically, is we take a plane that's perpendicular to the 3-phase contact line, and it's actually on that perpendicular plane that we measure the contact angle. So that's what we do. Here I'm actually going to show the raw image at the end. Okay, so here's the raw image, and the contact line is measured here. Now, the way it's been shown here is this is the contact angle through the CO2. Traditionally, you measure it through the water. Okay, so you'd measure actually this angle, which is about 45 degrees. So that's water wet, right? The water, which is shown here in this gray color, likes the surface, the CO2 doesn't. Okay. So we can measure contact angle, we can talk about that, and we can also then look at a reservoir sample where we measure relative permeability. So we can do both. We can look at the wettability and we can relate it to recovery. So here's steady state flow in a reservoir sample. So these are 8 billion voxel images, just showing 2-dimensional cross sections. Here are the raw images, here are the segmented images, and you start off with mainly oil, water in microporosity, you inject more water, and you see by the end, you've got something that looks almost blue. So you could just visually, you say, this actually looks pretty favorable for recovery. So why is it? I'm going to show the relative permeability on the next slide, but this is the advantage of this type of measurement, is that you can measure these traditionally, and most of these measurements would be dismissed because in the textbooks, it says, if you make something oil wet, the water relative permeability should be high, it's unfavorable for recovery. And there are people who are dogmatic about this. I've been doing scale for 30 years. You can't tell me I'm wrong. Well, you're not wrong, but there's some cases that are different. And the beauty of this is it can interpret why. So we're going to show actually that the water relative permeability is surprisingly low. And the reason is shown in this diagram is you start injecting water, it's mixed wet, the water can go in some of the microporosity and some of the small pores, but there's not much flow there. So in the end, the water has to start going into the bigger pores that are oil wet. It likes the big oil wet pores. So that's what happens. You've got a fractional flow of 15%. The oil is here shown in these different colors. What that represents is a blob of water in the larger pores, but it's not connected through the big pore space, the macro pore space that we can image. So water is displacing oil, but it's very poorly connected. It's just filling a big pore here, right? A big pore here, big pore here, big pore, but it's not connected. Now it can do that because it can flow through the little nooks and crannies, the pore space and the microporosity. It can access all the pore space, but then it just fills the big regions and it's not connected. Fractional flow of 30%, well, you're filling more, different color blobs. 50% still not connected. 70% sort of getting there. That blue cluster's pretty connected, but not super well, is it? 85%, then the green cluster connects. 100% just injected water, well connected, because actually the oil is clinging to the surface. You can drive down to a low residual saturation. So here's the relative permeability. Oil relative permeability is low, low residual, but the water relative permeability stays low. This actually is favorable for recovery. So that looks good. But why is it? Okay, this looks strange. So the other thing we notice is the capillary pressure is almost zero. Now, normally people say, aha, that's a contact angle of 90. The interfaces must be flat. They're sheet-like in the sense that they're a flat interface. No. When you actually look, right, so every model hitherto was water wet, you have a bulgy surface with oil bulging into water. Neutrally wet, it's flat. Oil wet, it's the other way around. Water bulges into oil. No, don't see this at all. What you actually see, and it's sort of shown here, in the water wet case, you do see these interfaces that are ball-shaped. If they're mixed wet, and we repeated the experiment because the postdoc was utterly convinced that he had to be wrong because you know, the sponsor of this work said, no, sorry, you know, this can't be right, is that the interfaces are saddle-shaped. So they're curved one way, so water will bulge into oil in one direction, and in the other direction, oil bulges into water. Turns out that that's what's called a minimal surface. And minimal surfaces have been around since the time of Euler. So here's an example. On the left is a catenoid. You get this, by the way, if you have a soap film and you have two rings and you push the film apart, okay? And so what you have is you have air in the middle here, air outside here, and this is the soap film. There's no pressure difference between the air. So the curvature here, by the Young-Laplace equation, the total curvature must be zero, but it's got equal and opposite curvature in different directions. On the other hand is a helicoid. What you notice about this is if you imagine you've got two independent phases separated by a minimal surface, nothing ever gets trapped. Ball-shaped traps. You have a ball shape, there's one thing in the ball that's trapped and something outside it. Here, if you imagine this twisty surface, or this surface, both phases are connected. And in fact, there's the Gauss-Bonnet theorem that says that the integral of the Gaussian curvature, which is the two curvatures multiplied together, that integral is what's called the Euler characteristic. It's a topological characteristic. And you have a negative Gaussian curvature because one curvature is positive, the other is negative. That gives you a negative Euler characteristic. That is a structure with lots of redundant loops. It means it's connected. So a minimal surface driven by a wettability state that is neither water wet nor oil wet seems to give you favorable connectivity. Okay. So this is moving towards what I would describe as a sort of topological geometric characterization of multi-phase flow. And I don't have time in this short presentation to dwell on this, but geometrically, there are four things that characterize an object. There's volume, which is saturation in our parlance. area, which is the interfacial area between the phases or between a phase and the solid, the curvature that gives you the capillary pressure, so it immediately gives you what you want, and this Gaussian curvature that turns out to represent connectivity. It turns out that then you can do an energy balance with this equation shown here that actually relates that to a contact angle, right? You can measure the relative permeability, so how this flows. And then that enables you to tie in, and I haven't actually developed this and I'm not going to claim anything here, but a number of people have been working on a richer theory of multi-phase flow in porous media that actually includes these other parameters. And the problem to date has been the theory is great, but no one can measure the parameters. Now we can. And now I want to go back to the fuel cell application. So in this gas diffusion layer, you wanted the gas to go in and the water to come out. Looking at this, you want minimal surfaces. You want something that's mixed wet. Do you know how they make these gas diffusion layers? They have this fibrous material that's naturally water wet. They coat a fraction of those fibers in basically an oily coating, a plasticky coating. And so some bits are oil wet or actually water repellent, so they don't like water. Some places attract water, so they're water wet. So empirically, in the design of these gas diffusion layers, they've made a mixed wet state. Now, I'm not saying I didn't make that up. That's what they do. We have now the tools to look at that in a much more quantitative fashion and design a material with exactly the optimal properties. Because at the moment, it's sort of, oh, we do this mixture and it seems to work, right? Now we know how to design it. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is it gets even more complex than that when you increase the flow rate. We introduced this idea at a higher flow rate, you started flipping. So with the synchrotron, we can see this flipping. So we see these colors changing. What they're looking at is they're looking at the big ganglia. And when we increase the flow rate, what we find is that we get this sort of flip-flop, and things get connected and disconnected. And what this is, it's the origin of how, as we know, as we increase the flow rate, we tend to get a higher relative permeability. And it's not because ganglia of the non-wetting phase are getting pushed through the pore space. What it is instead is that you have at very low flow rate, the non-wetting phase goes through all the bigger pores. So in this case here, right, there's this extremely tortuous pathway through the rock. But there's a shortcut here. If it are going to take that shortcut, the conductivity would increase enormously. But it hasn't got the energy because it's very low flow to do it. When I increase the flow rate, you have enough energy to make that shortcut. So now you have a much more efficient pathway through the pore space. You don't even need to bother about these dead ends. Then sometime later, that shortcut disappears. So what happens is a bit like flow controlled by traffic lights. There's a nice little shortcut down that side road, but you have to wait a minute at the traffic light, right? Then you're allowed to go, zoom, then it's blocked, right? And that's what's happening when we increase the flow rate. And then we see this even at quite low flow rates, actually in a regime that traditionally people have thought was capillary controlled. So very, very briefly now, because I'm aware of the time, I'll talk a little bit about the modeling, right? So for many years, we've been able to understand some displacement processes in water wet media accurately. And here's some predictions we made some years ago. But we do have a problem. We have to deal with multiple length scales, okay? So here are some reservoir samples where we see large vugs, you know, which you can actually see at the scale of millimeters. And then there's even microporosity down to tens of nanometers. So what we do is we do pore network modeling. And pore network modeling is not, oh, it's a simplified representation of the pore space with balls and sticks. What we view it as is an upscale representation of the physics. That's it, okay? And we can use actually direct simulation in the pore space as a way of informing empirical rules for our network, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to find a network model that we history match to match our rich experimental data sets. Because hitherto what people have done is they've run a model, they've compared against a relative permeability measured on a different sample in a different way that's been dug up from an oil company. And if the results look the same, the company says, oh, well, that's interesting, but obviously we'll use the experiments. And if they look differently, it shows that the model's rubbish. And we're sort of stuck, right? We've gone actually rather slowly. So what we do is we first of all realize that when we do repeat experiments, we don't always get the same results. So here is showing actually that CO2 trapping experiment that was repeated. And what you see is when we do a repeated experiment, the intermediate size pores are not necessarily wrongly filled, I mean differently filled. From one experiment to another, there's a discrepancy in the pore filling in individual pores. So if we look, is this pore filled in the same way, of around 10 to 20%. And as we look at more complex systems, these are carbonates, that discrepancy, which is shown here, can be as high as 25 or 30%. So what we're going to do is, we take a network model. The network, the structure is based on the image of the rock, okay? Then we've got an image-based experiment, so we can see pore by pore how the fluid fills. And all we need to tune is the contact angle. Right? So what we do is we take our energy balance as an initial guess. So in our experiments, for instance, around 98 degrees. Okay, so we start off with this as an initial guess. And then we adjust the individual contact angles to get the filling sequence right. And when we do this in a very simple optimization routine, we're not doing something fancy. It's not like history matching and reservoir simulation. It takes just a few minutes to run. It actually takes less than a minute to run the network model. An hour or two to do the optimization. We can drive the discrepancy in the filling, which is this black line, almost to zero. Not completely to zero. It's not perfect, but it's better than repeat experiments, so it's good enough. And then, then we make predictions. So what's shown here is a water wet case. Here's the capillary pressure. The green line is where we use the initial guess, which is the energy balance contact angle, the one that gives you the right energy. If we have different initial guesses, actually, our predictions aren't so good. But this is a physically based initial condition. Mixed wet case with this low negative capillary pressure. Again, we can predict this with the model within the considerable uncertainties of the experiments. And then here are the relative permeabilities. What is shown as the points are our measurements. These other points are other measurements in the literature. Our predictions go through those points, again, within the error. And there's a bit of fuzz here depending on our initial conditions in the model. In the mixed wet case, again, we can make very good predictions. So the idea is we use an imaging experiment to calibrate a model. Then we have a model that we can make predictions with, and then we can look at different scenarios. So what happens if we had a different injection sequence, or if we change pore structure, or if we change wettability? So I'm going to wrap up here. There's much more I can say, but obviously we need to have time for questions. So we have very dynamic displacement. Okay, so this is a challenge for models, right? Both including other geometric factors, but also the dynamics. We can explain some unexpected features with these minimal surfaces. And we've developed what I describe as microfluidics measurements for porous materials. We can measure flow, relative permeability, but we also got the Pore-scale configurations. We got a complete geometric characterization, and that helps us constrain and calibrate and validate our models. So we're no longer sort of, shooting blind when it comes to our modeling. Okay. We've also done a lot of work on three-phase flow, but I haven't got time to talk about that. The Pore-scale models, actually, there's so many uncertainties. You cannot have a first principles predictive model. I'm sorry. I just don't believe it's correct. A bit like having a first principles predictive reservoir simulator. You do need some calibration, right, or history matching. Okay, and the idea is hopefully we get to better predictions and better design of a variety of processes. So yeah, it is important. Okay, and we do need to understand it. So lots and lots of applications. Okay, I've tried to put them all together here. Okay, and I'd like to end here by just acknowledging my sponsors. We have been very fortunate that our experiments and our equipment has been funded by the oil industry, both to look at oil recovery and CO2 storage. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge our funders, and particularly in the most recent years, Shell. And yeah, I'll make a plug for my book. That was published now 3 years ago, and when I use we, I'm talking about the porous media community, has really opened up. And so there's lots more new things that are coming, and particularly with the very rich variety of new applications. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin, for this very inspiring talk. I'm not sure if we can clap, but let's.
Yeah, I can see Bill and Sebastian giving a little clap. Okay, thank you.
So I give the floor to Sebastian. Please type in your questions, and Sebastian will go through them.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm going to try and read through the questions as they come through here. First one is from Majid. Thank you for a nice talk, Martin. you mentioned the need for improving theories. One area, hold on, then there seemed to be part of the question missing, Majid.
Yeah, I hit the return button too early. I'm sorry.
Okay, so just go ahead and ask your question directly then. But if the others could just please type their questions.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll try to be short. So you explained very nicely that how complex it is under dynamic conditions, and you mentioned the need for improving the theory. And it seems to me that the improvement you are currently providing is related to one parameter, which is the relative permeability, and a bit in the capillary pressure formula, capillary pressure saturation relationship. I didn't see that. But shouldn't really the improvement go beyond that, not just the parameter, but look at Darcy's law itself that offers a seemingly linear relationship between pressure gradient and flow rate, but then you show it's not really linear.
Yeah.
And so shouldn't really one look at that as well? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is in this graph, right? There's pressure gradient against flow rate, and it's linear, and then you get a power law here. So I entirely agree, Majid. So what we're providing at the moment is, and again, you know, there's a wider community here, very rich data sets where you know everything. You've got all the parameters, right? I'm not claiming I know the theory. So maybe there's a challenge there, right? For those of us who do dabble in theory, right? So Majid, you know, no pressure, but yeah, we have an unparalleled richness of observation. And that then allows us to test the theories and maybe to develop new theories. So yeah, I'm not making any statements. I'm not saying that Darcy's law is valid. Yes, I have measured relative permeability in a region where it's sort of okay for a specific displacement process, but actually I'm not making any judgments. I'm saying this is what I've measured.
Wonderful, thank you.
Next question is from Bill Rossen. He asked, I think at the beginning of your talk, the residual saturation for CO2 was greater than that with oil. Is that correct?
No, actually it was the other way around, Bill. Yeah, I sort of skipped through it. If you look here, yeah, sorry, it's poorly annotated, this graph. So I apologize for that. Yeah, because it's just got rehab as Chris Pentland. Okay, sorry, I should have said this. These points are actually with an oil water system, right? But it's water wet, right? So it's a refined oil. These points here are experiments done with a CO2 water system using traditional core flooding techniques. Chris Pentland was my first PhD student to do this, and Rehab El-Maghrabi was the PhD student who repeated it, did more experiments. So I apologize for that. Next time I give the presentation, I'll be clearer with to indicate on the graph.
Thank you, Martin. Next question is from Omid Sharoki, and if I butcher anyone's surnames or names, please accept my apologies. Great talk, thank you, Martin. And thanks. Question is, how do you think the wettability distribution can be related to relative permeability, for example, through correlation lengths? Okay,
nice question. So this is the most recent work that we've been done, and this is only in the last few weeks. So, okay, I mean, we can relate it because we sort of got classic water wet behavior. We got classic oil wet behavior, actually, that we can observe. And this mixed wet, which is interesting, where the contact angles are sort of distributed around 90 degrees. But now we've looked at correlations. So we got our model. If we put the contact angle distribution and randomize it spatially and put it in our model, we get terrible predictions. So what we've observed is two things. One, not a big surprise, the bigger pores tend to be more oil wet, right? And that's something that's been hypothesized in the literature for many years. The second thing is we find a bit of a spatial correlation in wettability. The wettability tends to be sort of clumped together. It's not a very strong correlation, but we do see a correlation length that's about 4 pore lengths. So yes, there's a correlation both spatially and in terms of pore size that we observe. It's difficult to do that directly from measurements of contact angle because there are uncertainties in those measurements, but it is also consistent with what we see from direct measurements of contact angle.
Next question is from P. Varden. You talked about non-deterministic processes, even in the same sample. How does this affect the simulations and other predictions?
Very good question. So the experiments we saw, and in fact, you've got the slide up there, it's actually the same rock that just stayed in the apparatus, right? Because with CO2, you can dissolve the CO2 and then re-inject, okay? So people have said, well, maybe there was a problem with the experiments, and if you did them more carefully, they'd become more deterministic. And that's probably true, but there comes a point at which you have to admit that porous media flow is so complex that the idea of really being truly deterministic is, I think, it's not going to happen. So I think what you should view it is, as long as you get the same statistical properties, which are, how much is trapped, flow properties, etc., I think you're doing okay. So that's what we're doing with our network modeling. We know we're never going to get a model that is perfect, that actually gets every single pore right, but we can certainly drive down the error to well below what you'd see in repeat experiments. But you're never going to get it to zero. And the reason is just fluctuations in the inlet conditions. There could be something during the flood that slightly changes contact angle. We don't know. But I think this is as good as it's going to get.
Next question, thanks, Martin. The next question is from Mick Tang Parikul. Thanks for the nice talk. A quick question: when you say ganglia blocking, is that meaning water blocking as seen in water wet media?
Okay, I'm not so sure about that. When we're looking here at these ganglia, what I mean is a blob of CO2 or oil trapped in the pore space surrounded by water. Okay, whereas if it's more mixed wet or oil wet, you have a wetting phase that's sort of clinging, the oil, say, is clinging to the surface, and then the residual saturation theoretically is a lot lower because it continues to flow in layers. I hope that helps. So when I was talking about ganglion, it's sort of this, it's this video. So I don't know if it, so that's, I hope that's what I mean. This, oh, sorry, I'm pointing at the screen. Sorry, I need this. This is what I refer to as a ganglion. It's surrounded by water. Okay.
Next question is from Rodrigo Gomila. Again, thanking you for the nice talk. And he asks, how do you assess the issue of representativity of these very small samples when you compare them to the entire reservoir?
Excellent point. I mean, that, that's true. It's true when we look at traditional samples that are, say, of this size, right? And now we're actually looking at samples that's somewhat smaller, okay? So we do most of our work on quarry samples, and a quarry sample is a quarry sample because one piece of stone looks like the next, okay? But when it comes to a reservoir, I think that's a good point. So what we're doing here is we can't say for sure what's happening, but we can look at the range of behavior, and we are beginning to see certain generic types, okay? So, I mean, we're never going to get around this problem. We know we only extract a tiny fraction of the reservoir to the surface, and obviously we appear to be making it worse by going to small samples. But what we tend to do is we can now do lots of experiments, and what we can do take is small samples of different what we consider representative rock types, right? And we get some idea of the range of behavior.
The next question is from Jen Roberts. She asks, is it known how common impurities, for example, in the injected CO2 streams, even if they're at very low concentrations, affect pore-scale effects such as those minimal surfaces? If so, do impurities change properties to aid trapping potential?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. It's not something that we've studied, right? So all of our cases are pure CO2 injection, but I'm aware that a small number of impurities change the properties of the CO2, right? The density and potentially contact angle. So we haven't studied that ourselves, but in principle, this sort of methodology could be used. So you could do the experiments with different impurities and actually see if that affects the pore-scale distributions.
The next question is from Isa Mohammed, who would like to know if the precipitation deposition of asphaltenes impact your measurements, and how such phenomena can be used, or how those phenomena impact the quantification of wettability.
Okay, very good question. So in the experiments I've shown so far, we've aged in a crude oil, and we've either done the experiment, then continuing with crude oil, or replaced it with a refined oil. In all of these cases, we've taken care that there is not asphaltene precipitation during the experiment. Okay, so we can quantify that by actually measuring the wettability. However, we have done some experiments in our lab with asphaltene precipitation, right? So we've actually induced it. And yes, in those cases, you do see a wettability change. And obviously, you can clog the pore space as well. So you see a change in permeability. So these experiments, I think we're pretty confident that nothing untoward is happening. But you can actually induce that in the experiments, and you can use that to analyze the pore-scale effects. So that's something that I would say when we're working on at the moment. Obviously, no one's doing lab experiments, but we are analyzing results on that. But I didn't have time to show them today, and they're a bit preliminary at this stage.
Thank you, Martin. The next question is from Miro Sain, and I'm not going to read this very long surname because I'm definitely going to get it wrong, incorrectly. Apologies for this. Miro Sain would like to know what determines the size of residual oil films after water injection in the porous medium. Is the size of the oil film left after water flooding a function of pore size distribution? Yes,
it is. Yeah. And so what happens is you tend to see these ganglia in the pore space. The smallest are of the size of the pore, and there's a power law distribution of ganglion size. Again, I didn't show that, but it's consistent with percolation theory. But yes, there is the sort of small scale cutoff is controlled by the pore size and the pore size distribution.
Thanks, Martin. Boguo asked the next question. Again, thank you for the great talk. What kind of specific opportunities do you think the unprecedented pore-scale imaging will provide for improving modeling capabilities at the pore scale, particularly pore network models for dynamic effects?
Okay, so dynamic effects is we haven't done, right? We've looked at wettability. But the answer is that we have the images, so we can use them for calibration. So what you can do is you can say, okay, I have a model. How well do I do against an experiment? And the other thing is it may help you actually come up with rather empirical rules. So rather than try a truly dynamic network model, which is computationally demanding, you actually just have a rule that says these pores have a probability of, say, some fluctuating occupancy and some average conductance over a given time scale. And okay, that sounds very empirical. Where do you? But then you've got the images that can say, well, actually, this tells you what you should see. So my view is that these images are really to inform you of what the average behavior is at the pore scale, right? And you can, network modeling has always been semi-analytic calculations based on micromodel experiments. What we're doing here is we're just bringing in a richer data set to inform the pore scale rules. So I think there's a lot of possibility here, right? What I'm less comfortable with is you can use direct simulation, and in fact, you can try and reproduce some of these trapping results, and we've done this with direct simulation at the pore scale. So there's nothing wrong with direct simulation, but I think to think that you can then solve, in 10 billion or 100 billion images, exactly everything from first principles, I think that's actually where the problem is, because it's just such a difficult task. But I think these experiments provide very rich data sets for you to compare against, challenge your models.
Next question is from Omid Rezans. Along the similar lines, are pore network modeling predictions also capable of predicting chemical processes, for example, bacteria growth, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, in principle, yes. We've done some work on dissolution experiments, right? Because there you can see the pore space evolve, and we've had actually direct simulation of that, not pore scale modeling. And I know other people have worked in that area. So yes, there are lots and lots. I mean, I've focused in this talk on flow, relative permeability, capillary pressure, because it's traditional, and that's actually what we've been sort of focused on. But it doesn't mean to say there isn't a huge host of other things. And I tried to sort of stress that at the beginning. There are lots and lots and lots of different porous media processes. And, this isn't, and some of them are very amenable to this type of analysis.
Take the next question from Amir Hadi. Bill, I'm skipping yours. You already asked one. Hi, Amir. Good to see you online. Ami asks, you mentioned that the size of the pores impact wettability of the pore. Based on this, his question is, can we conclude that pore deformations, with the rocks deform, also change wettability?
Possibly. I mean, it depends when it happens, because often you think that the wettability change sort of happens at the end of primary drainage, but in principle, yes. So squeezing the pores could change local capillary pressure. It can change the local pore morphology. So that's interesting. And again, I don't have the answers, But in principle, these are things that could be looked at. You could do, I mean, again, we haven't done this, but there's nothing actually stopping you changing the geomechanical stress state during an experiment and seeing the changes.
Then we have a question from Lynn Orr. He asked, what are the physical reasons for the observed variability in contact angle?
Oh, okay, yeah, I didn't have time to talk about that. The reality is we got rough surfaces. So we've got very complex rough surfaces, and they're rough at all length scales, okay? So the oil moves in. Actually, some places the oil directly contacts the surface, some places it doesn't. When we do our imaging, or indeed our modeling, and actually I don't think it's a restraint because our imaging and modeling is sort of the same scale, we don't see all that roughness. We just see an effective angle. So that effective angle will vary from place to place dependent on sub-resolution behavior. The other thing you find is that, you know, you do primary drainage, right? The oil has pushed out the water. You now inject water and you often find what's known as a hinging angle. So these interfaces are pinned. And in fact, that's the origin of minimal surfaces. Minimal surfaces where you minimize surface area with pinned contacts. So what we're looking at is pinned contacts, very rough surfaces, and then we could also be mineralogically heterogeneous, right? So different mineralogies. So there are lots of different reasons. And in fact, that's one thing that's really come out clearly from our work is there isn't one contact angle. This idea that there's one number that describes wettability is actually completely misleading. There is always a range of angle. And you see this particularly when you're around neutral wettability. So that's an excellent question, Lynn. Yeah, that's an important point that I didn't stress in the talk.
I'm going to take one last question because Hadi told me we need to finish around 4:10, so or 5:10 your time. So we can now next speaker.
Sebastian, is it just a quick thing? Because I know this in other things. I can't see the chat at the moment, but I should be able to see the chat afterwards, right?
Right.
So if I've got time, I could actually write in responses for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually thinking the same. So I'm going to send you the text report of the meeting because Zoom will create that automatically.
Yeah. So anyway, I understand we can finish, and obviously people should feel that they can wrap up and they're not forced. So I'll also one more question, and then I'll go out and try and answer other questions if I'm able to.
Last and take the last. Thank you for offering this, Martin. And take the last question from Dennis Voskov. And who thanks you for the great talk. And he asked, can you suggest how we can directly benefit from the experiments in pore-scale modeling at the larger scale, especially given the knowledge or changing contact angles?
Yeah, I mean, this is again a recurring question. People say, well, you understand a lot about the small scale, but you know our reservoirs are kilometers across. I think it is important because it's understanding local displacement efficiency, right? And hitherto, people have just assumed that that was something measured and changed in a history match and then focused on larger scale heterogeneity. Larger scale heterogeneity is clearly important, but now we have a much better understanding of one of the other things, which is what's happening at the small scale. So I think that they're complementary. We haven't solved the upscaling problem, but we now have a better characterization of knowing where the fluid goes in a reservoir. You know, how much do you recover? And of course, it has potential applications for all these other things. When you're looking at a gas diffusion layer in a fuel cell, it is, you know, we're just looking at the millimeter scale. So there are actually lots of other applications, funnily enough, where this is actually, you know, we sort of, you know, that's the end of the problem. But the upscaling challenge is still there, right? So, you know, there are lots of other things for us to work on. We haven't, you know, by no means is this solving everything, but I think it is helping part of the puzzle. We have a much better characterization of local displacement efficiency to put in larger scale models.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm passing back to Hadi then for some final notes.
Yes, thanks a lot, Martin. Again, I don't know if the audience could also join me to thank him by clapping or some icons. I don't know if that's possible.
So thank you very much. Yep.
This is, and I'm going to share.
Oh, it's lovely to see everyone here. Yeah, fantastic.
Yes. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to announce our next speaker will be Thomas Drisner from ETH Zurich on geothermal energy. So please stay tuned. Myself and Sebastian will post the link to the webinar of next week in our LinkedIn pages. So with that, I would like to thank Martin again and all of you again. Wish you all the best and see you next week.